Her name was Norma Jean Mortensen. That was the story. It was printed on a birth certificate filed at the Los Angeles General Hospital on the 1st of June, 1926, and for most of the century that followed, it was where the story of Marilyn Monroe officially began, with a name that named the wrong man. For 6 decades, biographers, genealogists, and the woman herself never had the proof to close the question of who her father actually was. Monroe grew up not knowing. She spent years trying to find out. She was turned away each time she tried. And the world moved on, content with the mythology it had already built around her. The orphan blonde, the lost child who became the most photographed human being of the 20th century. But in 2022, a small team working in southern France, not a tabloid, not a television network looking for ratings, but a molecular archaeology laboratory at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique, extracted 22% of Marilyn Monroe's genetic profile from 3 strands of hair that had been cut from her body on the night she died. They compared that profile against a DNA sample from a 75-year-old woman living quietly in Norfolk, Virginia, who ran an insurance company and had almost no interest in Hollywood. The result was not ambiguous. Keep that number in mind. 22%. That is a fraction of a dead woman's identity, recovered from keratin and grief and 60 years of silence. We will return to what it contained. This is not a story about scandal. It is a story about a woman who spent her entire life looking for a name she was never given. Stay with this. The official biography of Marilyn Monroe begins simply enough. Norma Jean Mortensen was born in Los Angeles to Gladys Pearl Baker, a film negative cutter, who worked at Consolidated Film Industries. The birth certificate named Gladys's second husband, Martin Edward Mortensen, as the father, though the couple had already separated. Gladys was mentally and financially unprepared for a child, and so Norma Jean was placed with evangelical foster parents in the suburban town of Hawthorne. Gladys visited on weekends when she could. In January of 1934, when her daughter was 7 years old, Gladys suffered a complete mental breakdown, was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, and was committed to a state institution. She would spend the rest of her life moving in and out of psychiatric facilities. Norma Jean became a ward of the state. From there, the official story moves quickly through the familiar stations of American mythology. Foster homes, a brief period in an orphanage, a teenage marriage to a factory worker named James Doherty, arranged to keep her out of institutional care, a chance encounter with an army photographer at a munitions plant in Van Nuys, a modeling contract, a screen test, a name change, Marilyn Monroe. The rest was, in every sense of the phrase, history. That is the story as has been told in over 400 books, in dozens of documentaries, on the covers of 250 magazine issues. It is a story shaped by what could be confirmed. And for most of the 20th century, the identity of Monroe's father was not confirmable, so the biographies left a careful gap where his name should have been. The first crack appeared long before the science did. Gladys Baker had once shown her daughter a gold-framed photograph of a man with a thin mustache, dark eyes, and a fedora worn at a slight angle. "This is your father," she said. She said nothing else. The man was Charles Stanley Gifford, her supervisor at the film processing plant, a man with a well-documented reputation for romantic pursuit who had had a brief affair with Gladys in 1925, the year before Monroe was born. Every serious biographer who examined the timeline of Gladys's marriage and separation agreed that Mortensen, whose name sat on the birth certificate, could not have been the father. The separation had occurred well before the pregnancy. The photograph existed. The timeline existed. The man had been named by people who knew both parties. What did not exist for 60 years was proof. Dr. Ludovic Orlando was not looking for Marilyn Monroe. That fact matters. It is a detail that separates what happened in 2022 from 6 decades of speculation, rumor, and tabloid assertion. Orlando was and remains one of the world's foremost specialists in paleogenomics, the extraction and analysis of DNA from ancient biological material. His published work centers on the domestication of the horse, on the genetic populations of prehistoric Europe, on the molecular record of organisms that have been dead for thousands of years. He is attached to the Center for Anthropobiology and Genomics of Toulouse, a research institution of the French National Scientific Agency, the CNRS. He did not arrive at this project through any personal interest in Hollywood history. He was approached by filmmaker Francois Pomes, who had spent years trying to assemble the documentary, Marilyn, Her Final Secret. Pomes had identified the only surviving grandchild of Charles Stanley Gifford, a woman named Francine Gifford Dare, 75 years old, living in Norfolk, Virginia, running her own business, and entirely uninterested in celebrity culture. She had been aware for most of her life that her grandfather's name had circulated in connection with Monroe's. She had also heard him deny it repeatedly until shortly before his death from a heart attack in 1965. She agreed to provide a DNA sample, a saliva swab. That was all that was needed from her side. The challenge lay entirely with Monroe. Monroe had been a platinum blonde for the better part of 2 decades. The chemical process used to bleach dark hair to that particular luminous white gold destroys DNA at the molecular level. Ammonia breaks the bonds in keratin in ways that render most standard extraction techniques futile. The forensic genealogy community had long regarded Monroe's hair as essentially unworkable for genetic analysis. Too damaged, too old, too chemically compromised. What Orlando's team possessed were 3 strands of hair, not from a styling session, not from a personal archive, but from the body itself. The strands had been taken by Monroe's funeral director on the evening of the 4th of August, 1962, the night she died. They had passed to the hands of John Resnikoff, a Connecticut-based authenticator and historian of physical memorabilia, who had spent decades building a documented chain of custody for biological materials from historical figures. From those 3 strands, Orlando's laboratory recovered 22% of Monroe's genetic profile. Before proceeding, the strongest objection to this methodology deserves to be stated in full. This is a legitimate challenge. It cannot be dismissed, and the research team acknowledged it directly. 22% of a genetic profile is not the same as a complete genome. A partial profile introduces statistical uncertainty into any kinship determination. The distance between Monroe and Francine Gifford Dare was also not direct. Dare is Gifford's granddaughter, placing her at what geneticists call second degree removed from any potential shared ancestor with Monroe. The further a comparison moves from direct lineage, the wider the confidence interval becomes. Critics of forensic genealogy have noted, entirely reasonably, that kinship estimates at these distances carry meaningful error margins. The methodology is powerful. It is not infallible. The research team responded methodologically. Orlando's specialization in ancient and degraded DNA meant that the laboratory protocols applied to Monroe's hair were specifically calibrated for fragmentary material, the same techniques used to extract information from specimens thousands of years old. The partial profile was cross-referenced against population genetics databases and assessed for the specific chromosomal markers that indicate shared parentage rather than shared ethnic background. The result was consistent with a granddaughter relationship between Monroe and Gifford. It was not consistent with coincidental population-level similarity. This is where the second evidence track enters. Entirely independently of the DNA work in Toulouse, Clan Monroe USA had been conducting its own genealogical project, a global mapping effort to trace the surname Monroe, and all variant spellings through documented lineage and Y chromosome analysis. Monroe's surname was her mother's maiden name. Gladys Pearl Monroe's family had come from the American Midwest, but the DNA project, working from a sample taken from a male relative of Gladys's father, Otis Elmer Monroe, confirmed that the maternal line of the Monroe family descends from a Highland Scottish soldier of the Monroe clan of Moray. That soldier had been exiled to the American colonies in the 1650s, following the defeat of Royalist forces during the English Civil War. Further research published in connection with the Monroe DNA project traced the clan's origins through 1,750 years of documented descent to southwest Ireland and the region surrounding the River Roe in County Derry. Monroe's maternal line had been Scottish and Irish long before it was Californian. The documentary evidence and the genetic record were pointing in the same direction. Almost nothing about the official origin story was complete. This is where the 2 tracks meet. On one side, a molecular archaeology laboratory in southern France, working from 3 strands of bleached and chemically damaged hair, extracting 22% of the genetic identity of a woman dead for more than 60 years, and matching against a living woman who had no particular desire to be matched. On the other side, a global genealogical DNA project with no connection to Toulouse laboratory, no access to Monroe's hair, no knowledge that a paternity research was even underway, tracing the maternal surname line of Gladys Pearl Monroe back through a Scottish Highland soldier, through an Irish coastal clan, through 1,750 years of migration and displacement and renamed identity. Neither team was looking for what the other found. Both arrived at the same conclusion from opposite directions. The woman the world had constructed as the quintessential American blonde, the product of Los Angeles and foster care and a factory floor, carried a bloodline that had crossed 3 continents and outlasted for empires before it ever reached the San Fernando Valley. There is one more detail in the archival record that almost nobody has cited in the mainstream coverage of the story, and we will reach it in a moment. But first, consider the human weight of what those 2 tracks converge on. Monroe herself tried, across the span of her adult life, to find Charles Gifford. She tried at 18, when she was still Norma Jean Doherty, dialing a number she had found by asking her mother's former colleagues. Her first husband watched her hang up. She was, he said, real sad. She tried again at around 24, already famous, already Marilyn, driving with a companion out to a dairy farm in the hills east of Los Angeles and walking up a long driveway alone. She returned to the car describing a man who had told her he was married, he had a family, and she should call his lawyer. She tried a 3rd time with her acting coach Natasha Lightis, who heard the exchange from a phone booth. Gifford's response was the same. "It broke her heart," Lightis said. "They're living descendants of Charles Gifford alive today. This is not a story that asks anything of them. Francine Gifford Dare provided her DNA willingly. What she received in return was not scandal. It was, after 60 years, the end of an unanswered question. The concealment of Charles Gifford's paternity was not a private moral failure in a vacuum. It was a rational response to a system that made acknowledgement catastrophic. In 1926, the year Monroe was born, American cultural and legal codes treated illegitimacy with a brutality that is difficult to reconstruct from a contemporary vantage point. Children born outside of marriage were classified in many state jurisdictions as filius nullius, children of no one, with no claim on the father's estate, no right to his name, no legal mechanism for support. The stigma extended to the mother, who could lose employment, housing, and social standing in the space of a single publicly known pregnancy. Gladys Baker was a working woman in a profession, the early film industry, that was simultaneously permissive in its private culture and savagely punishing in its public morality. Hollywood in the 1920s operated under an emerging system of image management that would formalize into the motion picture production code by 1930. Studio executives understood that a star's personal life was an asset to be managed, and paternity scandals destroyed assets. Gifford, as a supervisor at a film processing facility, occupied a position of professional power that an acknowledgement of an illegitimate child would have annihilated. His wife was already pursuing divorce proceedings and citing his infidelities. A second illegitimate child with a female subordinate would have destroyed what remained of his professional reputation and his legal standing in the divorce settlement. The falsification of the birth certificate, listing Martin Mortensen, Gladys's estranged husband, as the father, was not unusual. It was standard practice. Genealogists working the records of Los Angeles County in the 1920s and 1930s have documented hundreds of comparable cases. Women listing absent or already departed husbands as fathers, or listing no father at all, or constructing plausible proxies. The term used in family history research of this pattern is silent paternity, a deliberate documentary erasure, rational under the circumstances, devastating in its consequences. Monroe's case is not unique in its structure. It is unique only in the prominence of the name attached to it. The 1920s and 30s produced thousands of documented cases in which industrial-era moral codes, legal illegitimacy penalties, and the specific power asymmetries of workplace relationships combined to produce a documentary silence that sometimes lasted an entire lifetime and beyond. The silence was the system. The system had a name. It was called respectability. And it cost a child everything she spent her life looking for. There is something that remains when the science is finished. In the weeks before she died, Monroe gave an interview in which she spoke, as she often did, in the register of someone who had learned to translate pain into wit. She had spent 36 years constructing Marilyn Monroe from the raw material of Norma Jean Mortensen, the name on the wrong certificate, the name of the wrong man, the name that was itself a kind of fiction placed over a gap where a father's name should have been. She had built, from that absence, one of the most recognizable human presences in the history of cinema. That achievement was entirely hers. It belonged to no bloodline, no hereditary claim, no paternal acknowledgement that never came. Whatever the DNA revealed about her origins, it revealed nothing about the scale or the discipline of what she made herself. But the question that the evidence cannot answer is a different one. It is the question of what she knew or suspected about the depth of the lineage she carried without knowing she carried it. A Highland soldier crossing the Atlantic in the 1650s with nothing but his clan name and the clothes on his back. That name surviving migration and poverty and a continent reinvention, passing through generations of Midwest anonymity, until it reached a woman named Gladys Pearl Monroe who gave it to a daughter she could not care for, and a daughter who gave it up entirely when she chose the name Marilyn. And then 3 strands of hair lie in a laboratory in southern France, yielding 22% of a dead woman's identity to instruments that did not exist when she was alive. Francine Gifford Dare, who never knew she was Monroe's niece until she was 75 years old, looked at the results and said, maybe she would have been stronger. Maybe. The gold-framed photograph that Gladys once held up, the man with the fedora and the thin mustache, has not been publicly located. It may still exist somewhere in a box of uncatalogued estate papers. Or it may be gone. Objects like that have a way of disappearing when families decide that a silence was kinder than the alternative. What does not disappear is a question Monroe herself never got to ask, standing at the end of a long driveway, waiting for a door that did not open.